December 19, 1944, 11:00 a.m. A damp, frigid chill seeps into the stone walls of the old French barracks in Verdun. The room is heavy with smoke and silence. Around the map table stand the architects of the Allied campaign in Europe. Their faces are etched with a tension none have worn since the beaches of Normandy. Before them, situation maps tell a terrifying story, a thick, menacing bulge of red arrows pushing west, deep into the Allied line. The Ardennes forest, a quiet sector, has erupted. At the head of the table, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower speaks. His question is simple, its weight colossal. "George," he says, turning to one man, "when can you attack?" All eyes shift. There stands Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., immaculate in his tailored uniform, ivory-handled pistols gleaming at his hips. His expression is not one of worry, but of fierce, impatient energy. He does not hesitate. On the morning of December 21st, he states, with 3 divisions. A ripple of disbelief moves through the room. It is impossible. Patton's Third Army is currently engaged in heavy fighting east of the Saar River, facing east. He is being asked to disengage, wheel his entire force 90 degrees north, march over 100 miles over icy roads, and launch a major counter-offensive into the southern flank of the German penetration. In 48 hours. Eisenhower is skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George." Patton's reply is calm, definitive. "This has nothing to do with being fatuous, Ike. I've made my arrangements. My staff is working on it now." In that moment, the entire crisis crystallizes around a single, unorthodox commander. The promise is audacious. Its failure would mean catastrophe. Its success would require a miracle of will, logistics, and sheer, relentless drive. This is the story of that promise, and the man who built his entire doctrine of war around being the kind of calculated, unforgiving bastard capable of keeping it. The promise Patton made at Verdun was not born of mere bravado. It was a calculated answer to a strategic earthquake. 6 days earlier, in the pre-dawn gloom of December 16, 1944, the Western Front had shattered. Under a thick cloak of fog and snow that grounded the Allies' overwhelming air power, 29 German divisions, including elite SS panzer units, erupted from the dense Ardennes forest. It was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. But its goal was far more ambitious than defense. Its objective was the port of Antwerp, to split the Allied armies in two. To reenact the Dunkirk disaster of 1940. The initial blow was devastating. Thinly spread American divisions, some green, some battle-weary, were overrun. Communication lines disintegrated in the chaos. Rumors of German infiltrators in American uniforms spread paranoia. For the first time since Normandy, the Allied advance had not just stalled, it was in full, bloody retreat. A great, westward-flowing river of men, vehicles, and confusion swelled on the narrow roads of the Ardennes. And at the very tip of one critical road junction, a town named Bastogne, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division was moving in, not to retreat but to hold. They were ordered to a place called the Hole in the Donut. By December 21st, the very day Patton promised to attack, the encirclement was complete. The 101st and elements of the 10th Armored Division were surrounded, supplied only by perilous, weather-dependent airdrops. The German ultimatum for their surrender, delivered 2 days later, would be answered with a single, legendary word: nuts. But on the 19th, at Verdun, Bastogne was a symbol of the crisis, not yet a legend. It was a marker on a map, a town that was about to be crushed. The Allied High Command was grappling with a profound crisis of confidence. The swift, victorious march to the Rhine had been an illusion. The enemy, believed to be broken, had demonstrated terrifying resilience and cunning. This was the abyss into which George Patton confidently stated he would march, on a timetable that defied all military convention. George Smith Patton Jr. was by design and temperament the antithesis of the crisis. Where the situation demanded caution, he offered aggression. Where others saw paralysis, he saw only opportunity. To understand his confidence at Verdun, one must understand the warrior he had spent a lifetime forging. Patton was not a spontaneous gambler. He was a devout student of history who believed war followed immutable laws. He studied the campaigns of Napoleon, Stonewall Jackson, and the Carthaginian general Hannibal, not for dates, but for patterns of movement and the collapse of enemy will. He distilled warfare to a brutal essence. The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his. This was not a pithy quote for him, it was a foundational theorem. Victory was a cold calculation of applied violence, speed, and psychological dominance. He cultivated a theatrical, fearsome persona to serve this theorem. The polished helmet, the riding breeches, the twin revolvers, these were the tools of a commander who understood that his army must see in him an embodiment of unstoppable force. He spoke in profane, vivid bursts, demanding perfection and mercilessly rooting out what he called malingering or cowardice. To many, this made him a relic, a dangerous prima donna. The slapping incidents in Sicily in 1943, where he struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, had nearly ended his career. He was saved not because the high command approved of his methods, but because they recognized a brutal truth. In a war of annihilation, they might need a commander uniquely unburdened by doubt, uniquely willing to drive men beyond their perceived limits. When the Ardennes offensive began, Patton's Third Army was heavily engaged in the Saar region, fighting east toward the German West Wall defenses. But unlike other headquarters, Third Army did not wait for orders to react. On December 17th, sensing the scale of the attack to his north, Patton did the unthinkable. He halted his own major offensive. On his own initiative, he ordered his staff to begin contingency planning for a wheel north. He identified 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 80th, and the 26th Infantry as his spearhead. His G3, Colonel Paul Harkins, produced not 1 but 3 separate operational plans for the northward turn by the morning of the 18th. So when Eisenhower asked his question at Verdun on the 19th, Patton's answer was not improvisation. It was the reveal of a play already written, rehearsed in the minds of his staff while others were still in shock. He had already positioned his logistics, alerted his commanders, and shifted his mental gears from an eastern to a northern attack. The bastard was not just ready to fight, he had already calculated how to win. The crisis for everyone else was, for Patton, the long-awaited moment to execute his doctrine on the grandest stage. The promise was made. Now came the impossible task of keeping it, a task that would test the very machinery of his command and the souls of the men he drove. Patton's performance at Verdun was a masterclass in applied psychology. He understood that in moments of supreme crisis, senior commanders are not just strategists, they are the chief custodians of morale. His immaculate uniform amidst the tension was a visual statement of control. His immediate, specific answer, on the morning of December 21st, with 3 divisions, was not just information, it was a shock treatment for a reeling command structure. It imposed certainty on chaos. He was selling a reality he had not yet created, forcing the high command to believe in a possibility so they would grant him the authority to make it real. This theatricality trickled down. When he returned to his headquarters in Luxembourg, he told his staff, "We'll be in Bastogne before Christmas." It was a hyperbolic goal, but it established a tempo, a mindset. The impossible deadline became a rallying cry, not a subject for debate. He was weaponizing confidence, using his own unshakable persona as the projectile. The promise's credibility rested not on speeches, but on a logistical framework Patton had institutionalized. The Third Army was a uniquely responsive instrument. Its G4 logistics section, under the brilliant Colonel Walter J. Muller, operated on what they called Patton's circus principle, unparalleled flexibility and forward-think. Supply dumps were prepositioned laterally. Truck companies were kept on constant alert. The staff itself was a battle-hardened organism. When Patton gave the code word for the northward turn, the machinery did not start, it shifted gears. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead, had to disengage from combat, refit, resupply, and move out on new axes in a matter of hours. This required a precise, violent ballet. Traffic control points were established before the first tank turned. Engineers pre-scouted icy roads and bridges. Fuel and ammunition were rushed forward not to where the divisions were, but to where they would be. Patton's boast was, in truth, a testament to a staff he had trained to think as aggressively as he fought. The bastard had built a system capable of executing his bastardly demands. Patton's philosophy of command was simple, brutal, and effective. Constant, aggressive motion cures fear and defeats the enemy. He believed in pushing, not leading from behind. He was a ubiquitous presence on the roads during the turn north, standing in his jeep, a scowling embodiment of the urgency he demanded. His method was not persuasion, but compelled compliance. Officers who failed to maintain the schedule were relieved on the spot. He famously stated, "An army is a team. It lives, sleeps, eats, and fights as a team. This individual heroic stuff is a lot of horse manure." For Patton, the team moved at one speed, his. This created immense strain. Men exhausted from the Saar offensive were given no respite. Tanks and trucks broke down on the icy roads. Those that could not be fixed immediately were pushed into ditches to keep the columns moving. The human cost of this relentless pressure was real: frostbite, accidents, and sheer exhaustion. But Patton calculated this as a necessary expenditure. In his calculus, the cost of delay and defeat was infinitely greater. He was driving not just vehicles, but the will of his army, compressing the decision-making cycle of his enemy by the sheer, terrifying momentum of his advance. From the German High Command's viewpoint, the southern flank of their Bulge was a secondary concern. Their gaze and their panzers were fixed west, toward the Meuse River. Bastogne was a stubborn irritant, a traffic jam to be reduced by infantry. The concept that a major American army could reorient and launch a powerful counterthrust from the south in mere days was considered a logistical impossibility. German planning assumed the methodical pace of warfare. They failed to account for the Patton variable, a commander who valued time over tidiness and offensive action over all else. The initial scattered reports of large-scale American movements north from the Saar were met with disbelief, then dismissed as local reinforcements. This critical intelligence failure was a direct gift of Patton's speed. He was not just racing to Bastogne, he was racing against the German understanding of the battlefield. By the time German commanders like Field Marshal von Rundstedt realized the scale and threat of the Third Army's turn, Patton's spearhead was already at the gates of Bastogne. The bastard had stolen a march not only on the terrain, but on his enemy's mindset. The order was transmitted at 600 hours, December 20th. Code-named Operation Tink, it set in motion the most complex battlefield maneuver of the Western Front. For the men of III Corps, it was a disorienting, brutal pivot. One moment they were facing east, trading artillery fire with German positions in the Siegfried Line. The next, they were wrenching their vehicles onto icy, secondary roads pointing north. The 4th Armored Division, designated as the Spearhead, became a moving bottleneck of steel and human determination. Its commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, pushed his units in a series of overlapping, relentless bounds. The landscape itself was a formidable enemy. A sudden thaw had turned roads to mud, followed by a hard freeze that sheathed them in treacherous black ice. Tanks slid into ditches. Heavy trucks jackknifed, blocking narrow routes through the Ardennes valleys. Patton's draconian order, "Keep moving," was enforced with cold practicality. Wrecked vehicles were not recovered. They were bulldozed off the road by following tanks or engineers with bulldozers. The march was conducted under a leaden sky, the Allied Air Force still grounded by weather. There was no camouflage from enemy aircraft. There was only the desperate, grinding forward motion. Patton's presence was a force of nature on these roads. He appeared at critical junctions, in his open jeep, face ruddy from the cold, shouting at commanders, berating MPs for traffic snarls, embodying the relentless pressure he demanded. His ire was reserved for any sign of hesitation. At one bridge, finding an engineering unit methodically checking for explosives, he exploded. "There's no time for that. Drive over it. If it blows, it blows." The message was unequivocal. Speed was armor. Speed was life. The cost of this haste was written in the ditches, a trail of abandoned vehicles, broken equipment, and men pushed to the edge of collapse. But the columns moved. They moved through the nights, headlights piercing the fog, a river of light and noise flowing inexorably toward a town most of these men had never heard of 3 days before, Bastogne. By December 25th, Christmas Day, the 4th Armored Division was coiled just south of Bastogne, bloodied and exhausted from fighting through the hardening German crust. The final miles were the most deadly. The German High Command, now acutely aware of the threat, had rushed units to seal the corridor. The American spearheads were met by dug-in infantry, anti-tank guns, and elements of the Panzer Division. The fighting was point-blank, savage, and confused. In the village of Assenois, just south of Bastogne's perimeter, the key action unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel George Jacks of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion planned a desperate narrow thrust. Abrams in his tank Thunderbolt and Jacks in his half-track would lead a column of tanks and infantry straight up the main road, blasting through anything in their way. There would be no flanking maneuvers. This was a battering ram. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, the column launched. Artillery laid down a crushing box barrage directly ahead of them. Abrams' lead tanks fired their main guns into buildings point-blank as they rolled. German anti-tank teams fired from the woods. American infantry leapt from their vehicles to clear trenches and foxholes in desperate close-quarters combat. It was less a battle than a violent, moving melee. The column lost vehicles, men fell, but it did not stop. Pushing through the smoke and chaos, the lead elements burst into a clearing. Ahead, through the twilight and falling snow, they saw makeshift positions, foxholes dug in a ragged perimeter. Figures in muddy uniforms stood up, waving. They were not wearing the formidable camouflage of the German Fallschirmjäger. They were wearing the tired, frozen faces of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Division's Team Cherry. At approximately 4:50 p.m., the lead tank of the 37th Tank Battalion made physical contact with the defenders of Bastogne. The corridor, though narrow and precarious, was open. The first trucks carrying medical supplies, ammunition, and protein followed the tanks in. The siege was broken. In Luxembourg City, a message arrived at 3rd Army headquarters. It was from General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st in Bastogne. It read, "Your corpsman has arrived, and the patient is doing fine." Patton had delivered. Not by the morning of the 21st, as he initially promised. The weather and enemy resistance had seen to that, but in just over 90 hours from the Verdun meeting. He had turned an army, marched over 100 miles in winter, and fought his way through to a besieged force. The bastard had kept his word. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the Battle of the Bulge, but its decisive turning point. The German spearhead, already straining from lack of fuel and stiffening Allied resistance to the west, now had a lethal threat to its vital southern flank. Patton's 3rd Army, having forged the corridor, immediately began widening it, applying unrelenting pressure. The German High Command was forced to divert precious panzer reserves to contain this new front, gutting their offensive power for the push toward the Meuse. The Ardennes offensive, conceived as a war-winning gamble, had been strategically checkmated. By mid-January 1945, Allied counterattacks from both north and south had erased the Bulge, pushing the front lines back to their original positions. The cost had been catastrophic for Germany. Over 100,000 casualties, the loss of nearly all its remaining armored reserves on the Western Front, and the irreversible breaking of its military machine. For the Allies, Bastogne became an instant legend, a symbol of American resilience and fortitude. The 101st Airborne stand was rightfully immortalized, but the man who made their relief possible viewed the outcome with characteristic impatience. Patton saw the breakthrough not as a culminating victory, but as a springboard. He wanted to drive east, to trap the retreating German armies against the Rhine. He was ordered instead to continue the methodical, broad-front reduction of the Bulge alongside Montgomery's forces from the north. This containment frustrated Patton profoundly. In his diary, he fumed about lost opportunities, blaming higher command for what he saw as tactical timidity. To him, the true promise of his 90-hour turn, the chance to transform a defensive victory into a war-winning offensive, had been squandered. The operation also laid bare the brutal arithmetic of his method. The relief came at a steep price. The 3rd Army's advance, particularly the 4th Armored Division's thrust, was a battle of attrition against determined German defenses and horrific conditions. In the week of fierce combat surrounding the breakthrough, the 4th Armored alone suffered over 1,000 casualties. The wider 3rd Army operations to reduce the Bulge in January would cost tens of thousands more. Patton's drive had saved a division, but it had spent men and materiel at a fearsome rate. This was the foundational tension of his leadership. He saved nations by expending lives with a calculus that many found chilling. The bastard had won the race, but the bill for his speed was paid in blood. The Battle of the Bulge cemented the Patton legend in the public consciousness, but it also finalized his professional fate. He emerged from the crisis as the most aggressive and successful field commander in the U.S. Army, the general who had acted while others reacted. The press celebrated him as the savior of Bastogne, a title he gladly accepted, though it simplified a vastly more complex operation. Yet within the Allied High Command, his reputation remained deeply fraught. The very traits that enabled the December miracle, his insubordinate streak, his political clumsiness, his merciless drive, made him a liability in the war's delicate final phase and the impending peace. After the German surrender, his outspoken comments about the Soviet allies and his controversial administration of the Bavarian occupation led to his removal from command of the Third Army. His death in a traffic accident in December 1945 froze him in history as the ultimate warrior, tragically sidelined in peacetime. Professionally, however, his formula left an indelible mark on the U.S. military doctrine. The Third Army's performance was a masterclass in operational art, the level of warfare that links tactics to strategy. The Army's official history of the Third Army became a textbook. The principles he demonstrated, the primacy of offensive action, the orchestration of rapid movement on a grand scale, later formalized as air-land battle, the cultivation of an aggressive staff culture, and the deep integration of logistics into planning, was studied and institutionalized. He proved that will, when married to meticulous preparation and delegated initiative, could impose a crushing tempo on the enemy. Modern concepts of shock and awe trace a direct lineage to Patton's philosophy of using concentrated violence and speed to paralyze an adversary's decision-making cycle. Yet the man himself remains an uncomfortable paradox. He was a profound student of history who lived for the violence of the present, a believer in glory who understood war's cruel, unglamorous mechanics, a savior of nations whose methods were often condemned as inhumane. He was, in his own crude but precise terminology, the necessary bastard. In a war against a regime of absolute evil, where hesitation meant more death and prolonged suffering, the Allied cause needed a commander devoid of sentimental hesitation, obsessed with victory and willing to be hated in the process of achieving it. The relief of Bastogne stands as the purest expression of this uncomfortable truth, that in the darkest hour, salvation sometimes requires not a saint, but a brilliantly effective, relentlessly driving bastard. The frozen fields of the Ardennes have long since thawed. The scars of tank treads and shell craters are healed over by forest and grass. Bastogne is a peaceful town, its memory kept alive by museums and monuments to courage under siege. But the lesson of those 90 hours in December 1944 endures, colder and sharper than the winter that framed them. It is a lesson about the nature of victory in total war. George S. Patton's career forces a grim, inescapable calculation upon the student of history. He was, by many measures of human compassion, a flawed and often reprehensible figure. His theatrics bordered on megalomania, his discipline on brutality, his ambition on recklessness. Yet in the precise moment when the Allied cause faced its gravest crisis in the West, it was this man's specific, unforgiving brand of leadership that provided the answer. Not through inspiration alone, but through a formidable synthesis of will, study, and logistical genius. He understood that to save lives in the aggregate, one must sometimes spend them without flinching in the particular. To preserve an army, one must drive it past the point of exhaustion. To show mercy to a nation, one must be merciless to the enemy and to one's own shortcomings. His famous, brutal quote, "The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his," was the core of his being. The relief of Bastogne was its ultimate validation. He did not ask the 101st to die gloriously in place. He did not accept their sacrifice as sufficient. He moved heaven, earth, and an entire army to ensure they could live and fight another day. He redefined the duty of a commander, not to mourn the lost, but to create the conditions where fewer need be lost at all. This is the bastard's saving grace. War is a realm of ugly choices. Patton made the ugliest ones with a clear-eyed focus on the final result. He was the weapon the free world needed, but was uneasy wielding. In the end, his story is not one of heroism in the classical sense. It is a case study in effective violence, a reminder that when survival is at stake, the winning trait is not always nobility. Sometimes, it is the relentless, calculated, and deeply uncomfortable will of a bastard who knows how to win.